I am so excited to introduce you all to our speaker, Dr. Charles Fogelman. To give a quick introduction of stuff he does, Dr. Charles Fogelman is a human geographer with research interests in international development, gender, and climate change. His current work includes a focus on repairing the wrongs of the past and the present. He teaches in the Global Studies and Women and Gender and Global Perspectives programs at the University of Illinois. We are so excited to have him here to speak on the way in which human systems play a role in determining who bears the brunt of climate catastrophe. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I appreciate it. Thank you to all of you for being here. This is great. This is one of my first time spending quality time with Kappa, and I'm so excited and delighted by the work that you're all doing. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to the sponsors. Thank you to the leadership. And thank you as well for considering Champaign-Urbana as part of the Chicago area. You get south of I-80 and we all kind of pretend that it's, I don't know, Kentucky or something. So thanks. Before I get into this presentation, which Andrew, give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen properly. Oh, bless your soul, thank you. I want to talk about the land acknowledgement that came up front and what David had to say about it. This sort of gulf between theory and practice that infects so much of our lives. It's easy to sit around and bemoan the state of the world. It's much tougher to do something about it. And it's even tougher than that to know what precisely to do about it. It's certainly insufficient to just acknowledge, but what's our role in giving the land back? What's our role in reparation? What's our role in righting the wrongs of the past that continue to be lived out today? So my talk today is about the alliances and the solidarities that we can build in this practice. It's about the power imbalances and how those can be ameliorated or at least attended to. The title of my talk is Situating Climate Resistance Within Global Systems of Power. And I want to organize it around my own research, both in Southern Africa and on climate change adaptation, as well as the kind of practical organizing that I do alongside that. And this being the Chicago Area Peace Action Meeting, I'm going to rather intentionally be provocative. And I'm going to ask questions about violence and questions about our own, I think, often uneasy relationship with violence, but how it is that inaction is also a form of violence and at what points we need to sort of attend to that. The quote that occurs to me often is Angela Davis's wonderful quote from many years ago, referencing the Serenity Prayer, where she says, "I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept." Here's a picture of Nelson Mandela. Here's a picture of Nelson Mandela, probably in mid or late 1963, during the time of the Rivonia trial. The Rivonia trial is the sort of second major trial that the apartheid state imprisoned Mandela under. It's the long-term one that got him on Robben Island and various other places around Cape Town and other spots for 27 years. Mandela, who passed away nearly a decade ago now, was the first democratically elected president of South Africa in 1994. So we sort of know his story, but we also know that he's sometimes treated as something of a cipher, a little like the way that Martin Luther King Jr. is attended to in the US. There's kind of convenient forgetting by those in power, especially by white folks, that Mandela was a member of the South African Communist Party long before he was a leader in the African National Congress. Martin Luther King's last 5 or 6 years are left out of US history courses because he was such an overt socialist in those moments. So Mandela is seen here at the Rivonia trial, which takes place between 1963 and 64, and that led to his long-term imprisonment. It's a trial that's most notable, I think, for what it did to he and his co-defendants, but also because Mandela was never somebody who said in 10 minutes what he could say in 4 hours. Mandela gave a speech from the dock at the Ravonia trial that lasted for, I'm pretty sure, a solid 4 hours, and that has this incredibly noted and often quoted finish to it. Mandela says at the end, during my lifetime, I've dedicated myself to the struggle of the African people. I've fought against white domination and I've fought against Black domination. Cherish the idea of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It's an ideal for which I hope to live and to see realized. But if needs be, my Lord, it's an ideal for which I'm ready to die. And he wasn't saying that theoretically. Mandela fully anticipated that he was going to be sentenced to death soon after that. As it turned out, he wasn't. As it turned out, at the Palace of Justice in Pretoria, he was sentenced to life in prison, along with 7 co-defendants, everybody but Dennis Goldberg, I think. But you can imagine the Palace of Justice in apartheid South Africa, in Pretoria, the capital in 1964. That's not a place where you go to find fairness and equity. It's a place where you find institutions that protect the apartheid state. That's what it's there for. It's no surprise that Mandela was sentenced to a long and brutal prison term, perhaps not death, but still misery, disability, and harm to himself and thousands of others there. That's the whole purpose of institutions of the apartheid state. I don't have a good segue here. I realized yesterday as I was making my slides, I don't have a good segue here. So let me just get to some film criticism. It will all come back together and cohere in the end, I promise. I want to talk about a really bad movie, really offensive movie from 2010 called Climate Refugees. A really offensive and ugly movie that is not just some sort of cast-off thing. It's something that has heft and meaning to it. You can see, I think there was a review in the New York Times, it looks like, by Robert Redford. There are a number of people, Ed Begley Jr., but also Newt Gingrich, John Kerry, Nancy Pelosi, all sorts of powerful folks are in the movie talking about climate change and specifically climate refugees. The reason I say it's abhorrent, I think, is pretty clearly illustrated by this image, which, there's I couldn't figure out a way to make the animated GIF pop on PowerPoint, but it shows, especially from majority Black and brown countries, all of these red arrows of climate refugees, people who are victims of climate change coming to the United States. There's a real kind of fear message embedded in this. You, Americans, should be afraid that the poors, that the Blacks and the Browns are coming, and they're coming to enter and, I don't know, take surpluses from us or something. So this is the ugly story of that movie. But I also want to give the movie a little bit of credit because it does have legit climate experts in it as well. This picture on the left is Bob Watson, who's an atmospheric scientist at the University of East Anglia, which is one of the real kind of climate powerhouses in the world. He's a big time UN and IPCC author. And what Watson says in the little subtitle that we see next to him is the kind of old school 2010 thing. If you're a climate skeptic, I hope and pray you're right. It's 12 years later. We know that that's, pardon the term, bullshit. There's no grounds for skepticism. It's sophistry, anybody who would say something of the sort. But until fairly recently, this language is what was at stake, this language of belief. It's a language that I think is kind of adjacent to other things that are taken on faith, other things that are seen rather uncritically, one of which is the idea of the tragedy of the commons. And that's a link that I want to draw rather tenuously here, but I think importantly. We've all heard of the tragedy of the commons in some way. Any of us who's ever been to an apartment that's shared by 4 or 5 young men and has used the bathroom knows what the tragedy of the commons is. It's that if everybody is responsible for taking care of something, then nobody's responsible for taking care of something. Hardin talks about it specifically in terms of grazing lands, and does it as a case for capitalist modes of production. He also tosses a ton of overt racism on top of it, but that's a different story for a different slide. The next one. The point is effectively that open access resource systems are going to collapse due to overuse. Hardin was a jerk, but he was also wrong. And Lynn Ostrom won a Nobel Prize for demonstrating that he was wrong. But his ideas of overpopulation, his ideas of competition for resources, they're really durable ideas. They're ideas that we see in this climate refugees movie getting repeated by the then and again Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. This durability, I think, demonstrates that in many ways the seeds of Trumpism might in fact be lived in polite liberalism as well. I have a selection of headlines from NBC here. 2018, 2015, 2021, and then 2021 again. And I'm bringing this up again because of this idea of belief. That's what's at stake on the headlines on the left side. Belief, but also a kind of undercurrent of LOL, look at these goofballs who don't believe in climate change. North Carolina Republicans, Ted Cruz, etc., Republicans in general, don't believe in climate change. That's what's at stake. And that's the narrative for quite a while in popular media, is look at these goofballs who don't even believe in climate change. To say what the difference in terms of policy between, say, Kevin McCarthy and Nancy Pelosi is a little more ambiguous. Belief is all that's at stake. Action is really, really limited entirely. There's no action that comes from anybody in the 538, let's say 537 seats of power in the US. So the progression goes really quickly from this left side of, oh, geez, we've got to do something, somebody has to do something, to this on the right side, which I'm very happy to say emerged just months after I turned 40. So I'm off the hook, everyone. But those of you who are under 40, you should expect an unprecedented life of extreme heat waves, droughts, and floods. And what I'm intrigued by in this is the way the kind of broader narrative turned from belief to we're screwed. Very little about substantive action at any point in there. Nothing about strategies of mitigation or strategies of adaptation. So the locus ceases to be about mitigation or about equitable adaptation. It becomes, how do we keep out the barbarians at the gate? This was obviously a few years ago. They've both had some weird plastic surgery since then, but still people who are responsible for US climate policy. The climate czar, I think, is his unfortunate title on the left in John Kerry, and the once again Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, on the right. Saying, again, the belief language, or saying the keep out the conquering hordes language, but once again, saying very little about what the actual actions are that are necessary. And we know those actions. We know that we can't burn fossil fuels as we're burning fossil fuels. We also know that even if you and I and all of us in this room, don't drive at all and cut our showers from 15 minutes to 3 minutes every day, doesn't matter. It's an inconsequential speck. The issue becomes dealing with those people who are effectively on the payroll of Raytheon, of Lockheed Martin, of Boeing, of all the companies that we saw earlier. The point here being that there's not a ton of difference. You're not going to find fairness and equity at the 1964 Pretoria Palace of Justice. But you're not going to find climate justice in the US Capitol in 2022. You're not going to find climate justice in the White House. No matter how woke the rhetoric might be, the practice remains, Let's let it rip. Similarly, even if we scale up, even if we say, hey, there's good stuff happening at, I think, COP24 or COP25. We have Greta Thunberg coming and scolding the politicians and saying they're bad. But we also have Donald Trump as one of the main representatives sitting in the middle. Donald Trump, whose only notable quote that anyone knows about climate change is something about a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese or something. The concern is that climate change is the most consequential, meaningful problem of any of our lives. It's quite likely to be something that massively changes the way production and consumption are lived in the world. And it's not something that voting for the right people is going to fix. It's not something that, you know, burning down Congress is going to fix. This is true in the White House. This is true in the Capitol. It's true in Springfield. It's true in Chicago. It's true in Pretoria. It's true in all these places. Something's got to give. And I think the question is not so much what has to give. The question is what happens to make it give. It's worth considering a little bit what comes next, I think. There's the Ursula Le Guin line that I think a lot of us have gone to before, that capitalism seems inescapable, its power seems unavoidable, but so did the divine right of kings or something. Something comes next, and it's still a very material question about what it is that comes next. I don't want to belabor the theory piece here. I do want to just sort of call out and endorse Joel Wainwright and Jeff Mann's book, Climate Leviathan, with their questions about what it is that comes next. They say the next thing could be climate Mao, climate behemoth, climate Leviathan, or climate X. I don't want to get into theory here. So I'll just talk about climate X. But let me just say, to go back to the Ursula Le Guin line, all these structures in which we're embedded are fairly new. You know, industrial capitalism, 1820, give or take. The state itself, as we know it, dates to 1652. These things seem like they've always been here. They seem like they will always be here forever and ever, amen. But they won't. Something is coming next, and we're part of the process of determining what comes next. And I think that it's a cop-out for those of us who seek climate justice, who seek abolition, who seek justice in general, to say, yeah, we know it's going to be different, but we don't know what it looks like. The old is dying and the new can't be born, but that doesn't give us a pass. We still have to imagine that new world. Wainwright and Mann imagine this really weakly. They say the possibilities are, you know, climate Mao, the anti-capitalist system, behemoth, the capitalist system, Leviathan, a global capitalism, and then climate X, which is what they advocate for, but they ultimately are like, ooh, yeah, we don't know what it looks like. It seems like it'll be cool, but we don't really know what it is. In the process of determining what it is that comes next, we have to make decisions about who we are, about with whom we organize. Whom are we going to align ourselves with? Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, but I think it's more important now than ever to consider that. Do we want to go to the, I don't know, what is this? I don't know, Whitney Biennial, Met Gala, something. Do we want to go to some place where there are a bunch of rich people and lovely cocktails? Or do we want to burn some shit down? Obviously, that's not the whole list, and we should not do either of those things lightly, but they should certainly be on the table. To bring them onto the table, I want to go back to Mandela. I want to go back to his 4-hour speech from the dock, and not the piece that's quoted towards the end, but the piece that he gets to fairly early in his long speech. The question of violence. Am I going to now read a long Nelson Mandela quote? Yes, I am. Bear with me. The second or third paragraph of Mandela's long speech, he says, I must deal immediately and at some length with the question of violence. I do not deny that I planned sabotage. I didn't plan it in the spirit of recklessness, nor because I have any love of violence. I planned it as a result of a calm and sober assessment of the political situation that had arisen after many years of tyranny, exploitation, and oppression of my people by the whites. All lawful modes of expressing opposition to the principle of white supremacy had been closed by legislation, and we were placed in a position in which we had either to accept a permanent state of inferiority or to defy the government. We chose to defy the law. We first broke it in a way which avoided any recourse to violence when this form was legislated against, and then the government resorted to a show of force to crush opposition to its policies. Only then did we decide to answer violence with violence. And this is the point where Mandela gives what we might think of as a handy how-to guide. The violence we chose to adopt, he says, was not terrorism. They considered clear-mindedly that there were a variety of ways to avoid civil war, a variety of ways to leave room for reparation, to leave room for justice for all after the tribulation was finished. There was sabotage, there was guerrilla warfare, there was terrorism, there was open revolution. And they chose sabotage before taking any other decision. It didn't involve loss of life. It offered the best hope for future race relations. Bitterness would be kept to a minimum, and democratic government could become a reality. I think at this point, the metaphor is becoming clear, but because I am an American and we never do subtle metaphors, I'll just lay it out even thicker in the next couple slides. Here's a Fanon quote from The Wretched of the Earth. A maybe overstated and dramatic one, but that was kind of his thing. Violence is a cleansing force. It frees the native from his inferiority complex and from his despair and inaction. It makes him fearless and restores his self-respect. Again, I'm not engaging in sophistry when I say something like the state is relatively new, dating back somewhere in the order of 370 years. The state is defined by its monopoly on legitimate violence. That's what the state is. The question of violence is dealt with. It's adjudicated. We're part of it. There's violence happening over there, and we are embedded in it just as sure as we're embedded in 415 CO2 parts per million. We are minutely culpable. We're not going to take shorter showers and drive less out of state violence either. But we are responsible for imagining another world. And I think part of that imagination has to be a clear-headed, sober, and serious consideration of when violence and sabotage might actually be the most just and equitable things in the world. Andreas Malm wrote a book a couple years ago called How to Blow Up a Pipeline. And in it, he wrestles with just this question. When is it the just thing to say, screw it? We can hold up picket signs outside of Exxon headquarters as long as we want. But at some point, Exxon just doesn't care. And that doesn't work anymore. Something needs to change. As the fatalism that we see in the MSNBC headlines grows, so does the immediacy of the need for action. So does the immediacy of the need to say, yeah, climate change has happened, but there's a massive difference between 2.5 degrees Celsius of warming and 5 degrees Celsius of warming. For ecosystems, for habitats, for who lives and who dies. These are material considerations. The climate crisis is unprecedented and is going to both exacerbate inequalities and inequities that exist and to create new ones. And ExxonMobil, the people who go to, I don't know, the Oscars, the people who go to the Met Gala don't care. They don't need to. There is no need to imagine what comes next because they're safe. When when the parable of the sower is visited upon all of us, they're not the ones who are living in the little communities in Southern California. They're the ones who are up on the hills in Seattle. And there's also a sort of Sisyphean touch to it. Nat Turner's uprising, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, they weren't going to win. They didn't win. But they're notable for the ways that they galvanized people's understanding of what was possible. They helped to articulate very clearly that violence was on the table, that there was reason to consider that the way to seek justice was to break a few eggs. I want to be clear that in no way am I calling for violence, and in no way certainly am I calling for rashness. Everyone should be mindful of the fact that this is 2022 America, and any organizing meeting you go to probably has FBI agents at it. But as we consider our alliances, we can't sit around waiting for Joe Manchin to come around. Joe Manchin's not going to come around. That's his role. And if it's not Joe Manchin, then it's Chris Coons who's not going to come around, or Mark Warner or somebody. Does that mean that it's time to blow up a pipeline? I don't have an answer to that. But I do think that it needs to be a sincere and clear-headed part of organizing conversations. I think people should be empowered to say, no, that's bananas. Don't even think of that. But I do think that the conversation needs to be had. Another world is possible. Climate X, whatever it is possible. But the only way to get there is with the effective resistances and the effective alliances and the effective solidarities that are still to be born, and that I think are being born out of organizations like this one. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I did want to have some time, if possible, for some questions. So if anyone has any questions, could you guys put them in? I see that there have been some in the chat. Could you guys put them in if you have actually, if you have like a question you really want to answer, could you put it in again? Because I'm gonna dig through these, but there's a lot of you here, which is very exciting, and I'm not gonna be able to read all of these. So please put them in again. Oh, I think someone asked. Oh wait, no, there's another one in here. Oh yeah. Well, Charles, you can see the
See them.
the thing.
Yeah, this is fun. I thank you so much for contributing to the chat, and apologies that I have so little Zoom acumen that I wasn't able to look at the chat while I was talking. I think the question that's compelling, that's come up a couple times here, is what are the suggestions? I don't know. You know, and I think that's what's so frustrating. I'm here as a provocation. I think, what are my suggestions? I don't know, because I'm not going to blow up a pipeline tomorrow. I've got 2 kids, and not until I've paid for their college, not until I don't know, not until they're already in therapy talking about me, am I going to get incarcerated on their behalf. So I don't know. And I think that this is something that needs to be in the conversation, that the idea of us as dangerous needs to be considered. Because if we're polite, if we're cool, if we're obsequious and saying, could I have a few minutes of your time, Mr. Manchin? We don't matter. And I think that that's a meaningful question that needs to be considered.
I'm sorry, you're talking to me.
Sorry?
Oh, you're talking to me, or?
Oh, no, not to you. Sorry, I was recording a voice message.
So do I think that real violence changes anything? I certainly think it has. You know, I certainly think that there's precedent. And I don't feel entirely comfortable with saying that. And I certainly don't feel comfortable with overtly advocating it, which is why I'm very much dancing around the margins in this presentation. What does it take to make change happen? And I don't have comfortable answers to that. I think that it's a meaningful question, and I think that actual civil disobedience is certainly necessary, and what form that takes is a meaningful question. And when that becomes violence is also a meaningful question. If we'll use Andrew as the useful example. If Andrew in the middle of a class just gets fed up with me and punches me, that's violence, overt, no question. But if Andrew goes out after this and blows up a pipeline, is that violence? I don't know. And I think that there's often a lot of gray area and often a lot of ambiguity there. And Ivy, I think, makes the important point here that care and mutual aid are also forms of nonviolent disobedience. This is not meant to foreclose on anything that is more meaningful and anything that is rooted in love. And not to say that violence, it cannot be rooted in love, but to say that those demonstrations of care and of love are much more meaningful and are absolutely necessary. Whether or not sabotage or violence or whatever is necessary, I'm ambivalent on, but whether or not mutual aid, care, and love are necessary, I think is clear, and yes. And Mary, to answer your question, yes, please do email me. I'll drop my email in the chat. Carolyn asks a great question, I think, which is actually something that I've considered, again, through the Southern African lens before. What thoughts or recommendations do you have to grab hold of the media messaging? Some of you might be familiar with the Roads Must Fall movement in South Africa, part of the kind of decolonization of education idea there. And the University of Cape Town, one of the best universities in the world, on this beautiful campus, is built on land that was given to the university by Cecil Rhodes, the white supremacist, diamond magnate, scholarship endorser, et cetera, at his death around 1902 or so. You know all the violence that had to go into that land being Cecil Rhodes's to donate in the first place. We don't need to rehash that. I think that's colonialism. Part of the Rhodes Must Fall movement was the fact that there was a big Cecil Rhodes statue right in the middle of the University of Cape Town campus, which is obviously not the whole of colonial education systems, but it certainly stands for it in a certain way. It's like a Christopher Columbus statue in Chicago. There was a movement to take it down. People talked about it. People protested. People went there. And then a Zimbabwean student, Chumani Makwele, called the news media and said, hey, I'm going to throw some shit on the statue, and I want you to send your cameraman. And the reporters were all there. You can see pictures of Makwele throwing poop on the statue. Did that get the news media out? You bet it did. Did that get that story to the AP and Reuters and Agence France Presse? Yeah, it did. So I do think that there's a relationship here. Whether throwing feces is violence or not is your own question to answer, but is something to consider that the news media do play a role, and the spectacular is what's more compelling.
Professor Fogelman, can I just verbalize a question, because I can't type it that quickly into my iPad. Going back to that earlier slide, 2010, 2012, when there was still a conversation about climate deniers, right? It's not really happening. There's really not a man-made element to it. And that wrapped into that beautiful slide of the fear factor. So in 2014, the Pentagon released a report that I think momentarily a lot of people in the climate movement got excited about, because the Pentagon was acknowledging that a number one national security problem was climate change. So we sort of skipped through the national security problem and jumped on, oh, even the DoD recognizes climate change, now certainly we'll get action, leaving aside for the moment that they're the largest polluters on the planet. But what underlied that acknowledgement was that they saw it as a national security problem. And they saw it as a problem of, oh my goodness, suddenly 3% of the world's population consuming 25% of its resources. Ooh, we might have to fend off the enemy at the gates coming for us. So anyway, I only bring it up in the conversations around what peace really is, right? What the 200 years of Pax Romana are compared to peace through justice, exemplified by King's quote, right? The peace is not the absence of tension or the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice. So I guess I'm not really, I don't know if I'm asking a question, but I think we almost have to take a step back in our DNA and get to a framing of the conversation around this fear of the other, and around the idea, I guess, that we have to be willing to see the rest of the world as we see ourselves. And that's not an easy thing for Americans to do, especially post-World War II American society. So if you can just address it a little bit in whatever manner you'd like to.
Well, there are two things that you kind of conjured up to me in that. And I think the first is, the framing matters immensely. The Pentagon being like, yeah, this is a threat. If the framing is that kind of tragic one, where it's like, well, we're going to have a bunch of, you pick the countries, Salvadorians coming into the US. And that is why we need bigger tanks and why we need, green tanks or something, is an outrage, but is obviously useful to the Pentagon. And I think the other thing, I was just thinking yesterday about the term Black Lives Matter and how vital and important it is, but also how much it was weakened, and how much it was weakened very rapidly, to the point where the request, the ask became from the left and from the center that, hey, listen, you jerks, could you just say Black Lives Matter? And then after a sort of long moment, Mitt Romney, as senator, I think, said, Black Lives Matter. And there was a massive news story about it. It was wonderful. Everybody was excited. Mitt Romney didn't change anything. He didn't do anything. He's still propagating the same racist policies. So if the ask becomes one of belief, or if the ask becomes one of just saying something, then we kind of settle for these really, really tepid results, where it's like, Mitt, would you please just say this? It doesn't matter if Mitt says it or not. It matters if Mitt does it. It doesn't matter if the Pentagon believes. It doesn't matter if James Einhoff believes that climate change is happening, which he probably does. Ted Cruz probably does too. It matters the way it's utilized, and it matters the way that it's mobilized, and it matters the actions that come out of it. I don't want to take up too much time, but I'm going to answer two more questions that I thought were really compelling in the chat. The first, I think Liz asked if there have been any instances of success in actions against climate catastrophe. And I think that this is one that you could positively frame and say, sure, there have been instances of expanded belief, or instances of a couple green things happening here. But I don't know that it matters, because the idea of arresting things at 2 degrees Celsius is a massive reach right now. It would require basically fossil fuels being turned off in the next 2 or 3 years. So have there been tiny little successes? Maybe, but a little modicum of success doesn't do anything to negate the massive growth and the massive changes that are being engendered by what's happening. So there are success stories of climate adaptation. There are success stories of climate mitigation, but they are relative to whatever, pick a company is belching into the air right now, infinitesimal. And something else. Yes, did the FBI murder Martin Luther King? I don't know. They certainly tried to. Whether they were successful or not is an open question. All right. Go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I was gonna put this in a chat, but I'm kind of a slow typer. I was just wondering, so regarding the idea of sabotage, which is what Mandela advocated for, regarding the host of options, of violent options available against apartheid. Is that what you would recommend, like out of all the different options that have kind of a violent component regarding addressing the climate crisis, sabotage? Or
I don't know all of you. I have a public university appointment. I'm not about to stand up here and advocate sabotage. No.
oh, okay. I'm sorry.
I mean, go off if you want to. But I mean, this is part of the issue, I think, is this need to be circumspect about this. Am I saying we should blow some shit up? No, I don't want to be on page 4 of the Tribune tomorrow. So I don't know. But hypothetically speaking, is that the right way? Because I think Linda's question is a meaningful question and is absolutely the best way to kind of push back against a broader idea about violence. Without small successes, she says, how do we get forward? You gotta crawl before you walk, you gotta walk before you run, etc. Perhaps the big success is still coming. But how do we get to that big success? And I suppose maybe that's true. And I think that there is reason to have some hope for that a number of very small steps begin to grow and there are feedback loops in that direction. And that leads to this kind of metastasization of good. There's also the reality that, feedback loops of CO2 and methane and nitrous emissions happen much faster than we've encountered. And we've already lost a whole bunch of permafrost. We've already lost a whole number of species. I'm hoping to bring my children to Glacier National Park in the next couple of years so they can tell their kids what a glacier was. This is really, really meaningful. And to say maybe little steps at making this better is true. But at some point, we've got to say little steps aren't sufficient. I'm reminded of the incredibly often invoked comic of the little dog sitting in a room at a table with flames surrounding him and saying, this is fine. And I wonder at what point is that we? At what point are we kind of saying, yeah, we got to do incremental change. Incremental change is important, but incremental change isn't sufficient, is my concern.
Thank you so much. We do need to move to the next event, but I wanted to, if there was any last things you wanted to say, just take like maybe a minute to say them. But thank you so much for all the stuff you've done here today.
Well, I'll just say once again, thank you all for inviting me. I appreciate it very much. I love your insightful questions. I love the work that you're all doing. I will drop my email into the chat, and please, anybody, do feel free to continue a conversation there. Thanks again.
Thank you. Fantastic. Just awesome. Wonderful. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Fogelman, for that again. We're now going to switch over to our Peace Connect rooms. We recognize that during the pandemic, it can be tough when most of us find ourselves isolated from the community. We wanted to make sure that we dedicated this part of the summit to intentional community building, to give us a chance to meet strangers and forge connections and new friendships with each other. As such, we're going to randomly assign all of you to a breakout room with 9 other people. We're posing a simple reflection question. Why are you here today? We want you as peace activists to meet other peace activists passionate about climate justice and ending global militarism and imperialism. Let's learn from each other. Let's learn more about ourselves. Let's make sure our networks can forge new paths towards a world free of war and a world that averts climate catastrophe. Soon, you should be seeing a pop-out telling you which breakout room to go to. Once you enter that room, have everybody introduce themselves, and then we'll post the prompt question again in the main chat for everyone to see. Let the conversation lead wherever it may go, and we hope that you come out of these sessions with some new names and faces. If you have any issues, please message Liz or Charles for help.